Today we have another video for you in the Best of CET series by IMS. My name is Kumud Chaudhary and today we'll be tackling an area called critical reasoning. Now critical reasoning questions span a fairly wide range, so we will have to cover it in two separate videos, but let's get started with some questions today. Sometimes the question might ask you to identify things like the conclusion, inference or assumption. In other questions, you might be asked to strengthen or weaken the argument. In today's video, we will be taking a look at conclusion, assumption and inference questions, as well as a fairly ambiguous question variety called strong and weak arguments. Let's get started. The instructions are fairly clear. You have a short paragraph. You should read this passage and answer the questions that follow. The question that you can see on the screen right now is, which of the following is a conclusion? But in the exam, from the same text and with the same options, you would probably also need to identify the assumption as well as the inference. Now let's understand this very clearly. In such question types, the passage does not change, neither do the answer options. However, each question is presented to you separately, so you will get marks for each one separately. For the purpose of this video, we have clubbed them all together so that you get an opportunity to solve it. So this is where you pause the video, read the passage and see if you can identify the conclusion, assumption and inference.
If you like our content and want to experience the IMS pedagogy, you can join the IMS Zero Fee Prep programs that will give you access to concept videos, sectionals, full-length tests and more for free. You may click on the I button or on the link in the description box below to access the same. Happy learning!
Some of you might have taken a while to get this question done, which is understandable because critical reasoning questions tend to be time consuming. The easiest aspect to identify usually is the conclusion. So that's the question we're going to start with. How do you identify the conclusion? Well, we know that it is the author's main point. So let's break up this argument into the main point and the supporting points. As you can see, it's the last sentence where the author puts forward his argument. What is the author's argument? That the research provides strong evidence that vitamin D is going to be effective against cancer and that we should probably promote this drug. Let's keep this in mind when we look at our options. Now, please remember that the conclusion is usually given to you in the argument in one form or another. You just have to look for it. Sometimes it may be paraphrased, as in the case of this question. Our first statement here says, cancer that affects different parts of the body needs to be curbed with the help of medicines. But this does not relate to vitamin D, which is what the author is really trying to push for. So this cannot be our conclusion. The second statement, when the author says that vitamin D is the single most effective medicine against cancer, it translates to the second option. So we can be fairly certain that this is our answer. Nevertheless, we should be safe rather than sorry and look at the remaining options carefully. The third option says there are a few drugs other than vitamin D already being used to fight cancer, which might be true, but this is not the author's main point. So C cannot be our answer. The fourth statement, this talks about the Creighton University School of Medicine. We don't really need to read this too carefully to understand that this could not possibly be the author's main point. He's not talking about this particular school of medicine. He's talking about using vitamin D to deal with cancer. So D cannot be our conclusion. Finally, we have none of the above. We would have picked this if we had found no other promising options, but we have found one. So we should eliminate the last option and we should select B as the conclusion. The moment you make even one selection, we can be sure that B cannot be an assumption nor can it be an inference. So once you have identified something as a conclusion, it remains just that, the conclusion, nothing else. Let's look at the next question now. Now we have to identify the assumption. Passage is the same, the options are also the same. Our first option says, cancer that affects different parts of the body needs to be curbed with the help of medicines. Now, what is an assumption really? An assumption is something that must be true for our conclusion to make sense. In other words, if the assumption is false, the conclusion will also be false. So, is A our assumption? What if A was not true? Cancer that affects different parts of the body does not need to be curbed with the help of medicines. If we don't need medicines to cure cancer, then the author's argument falls flat. Then there is no sense in saying that we should try to use vitamin D to cure cancer. So A could possibly be our assumption. Let's retain it and look at the other options. Let's take a look at option 2. Option 2 has already been identified as the conclusion, so we don't really need to reevaluate it. Let's move on to the next option. The third option says there are few drugs other than vitamin D already being used to fight cancer. Even if this were not true, that there weren't other drugs being used to fight cancer, the author's point that vitamin D should be used would still hold true. In other words, talking about other drugs does not really affect my conclusion. Therefore, C cannot be my assumption. Please remember that the assumption is crucial to the argument. It has to be true for the conclusion to be true. The conclusion talks about using vitamin D to fight cancer. C does not talk about vitamin D, it talks about other drugs, and therefore it cannot be my assumption. The next option talks about the Creighton University School of Medicine. It does not really relate to using vitamin D to fight cancer. Therefore, we can be pretty certain that this is not our assumption. And the last option, again, we would have chosen had we not found anything worth our while. But we know that A is fairly important to the conclusion. So we eliminate E and we select A as our assumption. Let's take a look at the last question related to this passage. Which of these is an inference? Now, what is an inference? It is a logical certainty. It is something that we can derive based on the text, even though it is not directly stated. Let's take a look at our options. A has already been selected as our assumption, so it is unlikely to be our inference. We can eliminate this, at least for this question. B, again, we know is our conclusion. It cannot be an inference. So we can eliminate B. C, there are a few drugs other than vitamin D being used to fight cancer. Can we derive this from any part of the argument? What about the last bit? Far outpacing the benefits of any cancer drug known to modern science. This clearly suggests that there are other drugs apart from vitamin D being used to fight cancer. It's fairly certain. So C could be our inference. Let's look at the next option. Creighton University School of Medicine in Nebraska has been set up primarily to conduct research on cancer. We are considering this option now because an inference does not need to be the main point. It could be a somewhat minor point also. But is D something that we can derive with certainty? We know that this research has been conducted at Creighton University School of Medicine, but we cannot be sure as to what the main purpose of the School of Medicine is. It may or may not be to conduct research on cancer. Since we do not know what it has been primarily set up for, we cannot call D an inference. Again, please remember, an inference is a logical certainty. So, we eliminate D as our answer. And the last option, as we can see, is none of the above. We already have found a promising candidate, so we can eliminate E and select C as our answer. We're done with one set of questions, but we still want to tackle a few more in this video. Let's take a look at some questions related to strong and weak arguments. We still have two more questions related to strong and weak arguments. On the screen, you can see the instructions related to these questions. We have to come up with a short and simple strategy to get through these because usually these questions take a little time and we are still not sure of whether we have the right answer. So when you're trying to decide whether something is a strong or a weak argument, think about this. Is it something that is related to the question as a whole? Sometimes a statement may be related to part of the question, but not the entire thing. If yes, it is probably a strong argument. Does it provide some sort of a reason or justification to either strengthen or weaken the argument? Please remember, a strong argument could strengthen or weaken, so it can work in both directions. The strengthening statements are usually labeled with a yes, and the weakening statements are usually labeled with a no. Let's take a look at our first question now. Read the question and take a few seconds to solve it on your own before you look at the solution. Now let's see how we would go about solving this one. As usual, we're going to evaluate each statement at a time. The first statement says that India should continue playing in the conventional manner and not break tradition. This is clearly meant to be a weakening statement, that is why it's labeled with a no. Seems like a strong argument, but ask yourself the first question. Does it relate to the original question? Does it relate to whether the Indian Hockey Federation should or should not start the Premier Hockey League? It seems to suggest that it should not. But does it provide a reason as to why it should not? No, it doesn't. So while this is related to the question, it does not offer a justification for why something should not be done. And therefore, A would not be a strong argument. We would classify it as weak. Let's take a look at B. This says, yes, a newer format will make hockey popular once again. This seems to give us a reason for why the Premier Hockey League should be started. It will popularize the sport of hockey. So B would be a strong argument. It relates to the original question and it gives us a reason. C says, yes, sponsors have agreed to provide sponsorship if the new rules are introduced. This gives us a completely different reason for why the Premier Hockey League should be started. This reason is monetary. Nevertheless, it would still be a strong argument because it relates to the question and provides justification for why something should be done. Now that we are fairly certain, let's take a look at our answer options, and now we know that we want to choose both B and C. So we would select option 5, and that's the end of this question. We have one more to go. Take a look at this and solve it on your own. Now let's see how we would classify each of these statements. The first one says, yes, the violent and negative portrayal of every relationship has a strong adverse influence on the viewer's minds. Is this relevant to the original question? The question talks about families staying together peacefully. And it seems to suggest that watching daily soaps is going to disturb that peace. A says, yes, it is likely to disturb that peace because there is a negative portrayal of all relationships. So A gives us a reason for why it would not be wise to watch daily soaps if families want to maintain peace. This would be a strong argument, so we should definitely keep it. B says, no, people watch these soaps for fun. Even if you do something for fun, it would still probably have some sort of an impact on you. So, while this is relevant to the question of watching or not watching daily soaps, it does not talk about whether families should or should not watch it if they want to remain peaceful. In other words, it talks about a completely different aspect of watching soaps. It does not talk about whether they have a negative or a positive impact on familial relationships. So B is a weak argument. It's not directly relevant to the issue at hand. C says, no, murders, revenge and betrayal have become a part of real life as well. This very carefully evades the entire issue. It does not comment on whether daily soaps are good or bad for familial relationships. It says real life is pretty bad too. So that does not really address the issue. Therefore, C is irrelevant and we would classify it as weak. We know what our answer should be. A is definitely strong and B and C are weak. So our choice should be option 1. Only A is strong.